Got a very special video for you today. I recently recorded an interview with a great musician and educator, Brett Pontecorvo, about making scales musical on my podcast, the LJS Podcast. Thought I'd also share it here with you on YouTube as well. Hey, and if you like stuff like this, you want me to post more interviews with my guests here, feel free to leave me a comment below and let me know. But hey, without further ado, let's jump right to it. My interview with Brett Pontecorvo about making scales musical. All right, welcoming on the show today is Brett Pontecorvo, a keyboardist, educator, and he is the music production manager here at Learn Jazz Standards. Welcome back on the show, Brett.
Brent, thanks for having me.
Man, always great to have you on the show. You've been on several times, always a lot of great information. And I'm excited to talk today about scales and making them musical. So I want to ask you a question just to, start this and talk off. Scales are something that are fairly popular to talk about, right? Like a lot of people love scales. And when we talk about jazz improvisation, scales a lot of people seem to gravitate to them for improvising. Maybe they don't know the notes to play, and it makes a lot of sense. Maybe talk for a second why scales can be helpful.
Scales are absolutely helpful. I think they're helpful for several reasons, but first and foremost, like having knowledge of what scales to use over particular chords is just going to take a little bit of load off your brain when you're improvising, right? So if you see a minor chord and you know that it's the Dorian scale, well, it's like, okay, then you've got your bag of notes that you can choose from when you're trying to improvise, right? And I think it also puts things in context in terms of like where the important notes are, or like which notes you can use even from the scale to make the harmony stand out.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it too. And I think oftentimes, especially for beginners, like having scales, not only are scales really, I would say primarily their best use is for learning your instrument and navigating your instrument, but having scales available to you to kind of get that framework, to kind of get your feet in the water is really helpful. And of course, learning jazz language from recordings, like that's always important, and you really can't substitute that. But having those scales as a foundation is also really good to get started. And a lot of my audience is probably listening to me talk this way right now and going, Brent, what's happened to you, man? What have you changed? And I haven't really changed my viewpoint. Some people may know that sometimes I kind of distract from scales a lot because I don't think they should be the primary resource for learning jazz improvisation. That really comes from learning stuff by ear. And learning and making your own music too. However, I mean, really scales can be such a great jumping off point if used in the right way. So I think on the other side of the coin, what is the problem with scales when it comes to jazz improvisation?
Oh man. Well, okay. The biggest problem is that we're playing music, or we should be playing music and not playing scales, right? Yeah. And I don't even say that like in a condescending fashion, but like there's a tendency, if you are thinking in terms of scales, to sound a little bit mathematical and almost a little bit too orderly, right? Because you end up playing things that are linear, that you step, 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 and also, I think it leaves a bit out in terms of just neglecting what is going to cause the harmony to shine. So, like, just to be a little bit more specific than that, like, if you're playing over a 2-5-1, as you're moving from the 2 chord to the 5 chord, the listener should be able to hear, because of what you're playing on your solo, that you have transitioned chords.
Right.
So now you may be using the same scale, but depending on what you're doing with those notes, you're either going to let the listener feel secure and enjoy the music, or the listener's going to be like, what was that? That was a lot of notes,
Right. Yeah. And like you always hear from people that are like, oh, I can tell when people are playing scales, right? Rather than like improvising melodies. And you can just really tell like you can just tell the difference. Yeah. And I think kind of like the main thing that I think is important, and I know that that's kind of like the main meat of the topic that you want to talk about today, is, if scales can be helpful for improvisation, but at the same time, like they can be so detrimental to improvisation, perhaps maybe the problem is more how we actually apply scales to jazz standards as a framework for improvising. Is Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, this is one other thing that I think we forgot to mention just in terms of like why scales are helpful is like, you know, your brain is always trying to make connections, right? So when you have a scale or you have a mode that you know that's internalized, you're actually no longer thinking in terms of individual notes. Like it's been internalized, and so your brain has taken a list of 7 different items and condensed them into one idea, which then allows you actually to focus less on the scale, right?
Right.
And to focus more on making music because you've condensed this idea down. So sometimes something as simple as giving something a name, like, you know, if somebody's listening right now and I say, oh, you know, play the lick, you know what it is, right? We've condensed.
Right.
Oh man, yeah, but we've condensed that phrase, those words down to one statement. And so when somebody who understands, you know, whatever, I guess the jazz culture hears that, it's immediate. And I think the scales has the same advantage where it's like, we know our whatever, somebody tells you, oh, it's like that sounds Lydian. Well, you have a sound in your ear, you have a group of notes in your ear, and it actually allows you to step away from the knowledge and into the melody or what you're trying to say or how you're trying to improvise.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. So if we were to actually start figuring this out, like how do we actually make scales musical then, right? Because if that's the problem, if that's really what's holding us back from, you know, properly marrying this idea of playing jazz language and applying scales, but feeling like we can access these jazz standards a little bit better, like what are the ways that we can start taking unmusical, you know, boring vanilla scales and make them sound like actual music?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you got to start boring, right? So I would say like the first thing to do would be to make sure you know what scales you need to be using for a tune. So a really easy thing you can do in terms of that is like go ahead and look through your changes. If you see a 1 chord, you can probably use your major scale, right? If you see a 2 chord, you can probably use either your Dorian or your Mixolydian scale. And then you can actually go through and play them in context. And I think that's sort of the first step to like making the musical is just being like, here is what it is. Yeah. Did you want me to move on to making it musical, or should I give you an
No, that was
example of
good.
how-
No, that's a good obvious first step, and it's important to point out because I actually in my inner circle membership we do get questions. Our inner circle membership, we get questions about, you know, how do you pick this, like in our jazz standard studies, like how do you pick the scales over top of it?
Yeah.
What are your, because there's so many different scales you could choose, and you mentioned some of them. Is it sort of like the most basic scales? You mentioned Mixolydian over the 5 chord, Dorian over the 2 chord. Is that kind of where your head goes first before trying to think of melodic minor or altered scale or something like that?
Yeah, I would say almost always. Almost always. Simple is better. I'll never forget. I was transcribing a solo. It was a Red Garland solo. It was on C Jam Blues, and there was this one simple idea. It was like, I guess you can't hear me. I should share my sound. But anyway, it was this one really simple idea, and I spent forever trying to figure out what it was, and it turned out he was just borrowing notes from the C major chord, the C major scale.
Yeah.
And it sounded so complex, but it was the simplicity and his rhythm that even made it sound good, you know? So yeah, always simple scales, always major scale, your Dorian, your Mixolydian, your Aeolian first. And then sometimes as things call for it, then you can obviously add your minor scales or your altered scales or diminished or things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that when we're working together on our jazz standard studies in the inner circle, that we're always kind of starting from that place of like, let's use the most basic scales first. And then every once in a while, we'll also decide, okay, well, maybe for the 5 chord, let's play the harmonic minor scale of its associated 1 chord. And because that's a particular pitch collection, as we call it, that can make that sound like you're playing a flat 9, sharp 9 with the dominant there, mostly the flat 9, right? So sometimes you can also pick specific scales, I guess, to outline a specific idea that you want or a specific sound, sort of like you mentioned earlier. Like when we say Lydian, for those of us who have played a Lydian scale, Like you can kind of hear that when someone's playing ideas that really outline that sound. So sometimes you can do that as well. But I agree that, and I think we're going to see in a second, just because I know what you're going to talk about, is starting with a basic scale is completely fine, because it's all about what you do to the scale that is important, not necessarily what scale you're playing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. So we've talked about like starting with simple scales, you know, and if that's where you are, like let's say you're like intermediate jazz, you're getting comfortable with soloing, you're learning these scales, you can take an idea that is from any scale, and it becomes music the second you add rhythm to it.
Yeah.
So you know, if you were to take some idea, if you're in the key of, so we did our whole mini course based off of Have You Met Miss Jones, right? So if you were to take your F major scale and for the first section go, all of a sudden we had a phrase, right?
Right.
And all I did was play the first 5 notes of the scale. It doesn't have to be complicated. The second you add some sort of phrasing to it, the second you add some sort of jazz rhythm or something you've heard somebody else play, it becomes music.
Right. Yes.
And so go ahead. Yeah.
No, yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, rhythm is like something that I feel like most people don't think about at first when we're talking about scales or really about music at all. I think a lot of times when we think about like, how do I make anything musical or create great solos? We think about what notes to actually play. And so starting with rhythms is actually really smart, because you can actually start by not playing any notes different than what's in a linear scale, but just actually create rhythms. And I know that you teach in our course rhythmic motifs, essentially. So creating these like little ideas that repeat themselves, different ideas, but, you know, bunched together, that kind of really demonstrate really quickly just how taking simple rhythms can really transform a scale.
Yeah. And especially with that, you'll see if you have the opportunity to take this course, like especially in those examples, like I was extremely intentional to not use any leaps or any jumps. It is the scale, like up and down the scale with these rhythms. And it causes things to immediately pop out for you.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I think is worth talking about too, it's something that we do very often when we're working together creating materials, is we create scale maps. Because once you learn the actual scales to play, like we talked about Mixolydian over the 5 chord, and you're kind of just identifying what scales do you play over a song as being kind of a step one. A natural progression from there too is, well, how do you actually connect those scales together? Maybe can you talk a little bit about scale maps and how that can be helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. So a scale map is, or the way that I think about it, it's scales with voice leading. It's scales where you are not stopping, you're playing an 8th note pattern over the whole song, and you are not restarting. So you know, for example, in the very beginning of Have You Met Miss Jones, we have a transition between F major 7 and an F sharp diminished 7. And so we go up just the F major scale, and on our way down, use that diminished scale. And it just allows us to say, okay, I am switching from this F on the top here, which properly relates to the F major chord, to this F sharp, right? And then bringing it back down. So, and then we keep doing it. We go through it for the whole tune. And something that's going to happen is you're going to see your modes and your major scale start to kind of run together, right? So when we get to the G minor chord, in this particular example, it's labeled as you should use a G Dorian here. But if you look at the actual pitches, they reflect an F major scale, right? So from the second you start scale mapping or playing these scales up and down using voice leading, you're starting to kind of blend everything together, right? But the reason the modes are important is because they're highlighting the notes that are most relevant to that chord change, right? So if I say that G Dorian is what you should be using over the G minor scale, that's letting my brain immediately know, well, the 1, 3, 5, and 7 are the 1, 3, 5, and 7 of the G Dorian scale, even if I'm playing notes that look like F major.
Right. Because, yeah, and just to like kind of reiterate what you're saying, when we talk about voice leading, I mean, I guess the easiest way to define that is you're just connecting from the nearest core tone or the nearest scale tone in this case. So you're going like, say, up the F major scale, and then you're not necessarily looking to start that diminished scale, which is the second chord on the root. You're looking to connect it to the nearest one, because when we are actually playing music, when we're improvising, that's more like what we're doing, right? We're not jumping from one chord to the next, starting on the root. That won't sound very good. It won't sound natural at all. So connecting those, but when you do that, you'll inevitably find that when you hit that 2 chord, you're going to start on, I think in this particular example, you voice lead from that diminished 7th chord, and you end up landing on the nearest chord tone being an F. And since G Dorian, if you know your modes, is the same as F major, it's really just an F major scale, but you're playing it over a G Dorian. So kind of what you're saying is, well, then why do we even have modes at all? Why don't we just think of it as a major scale? And I guess you're sort of saying that it's because we needed to be, I guess it's, we were trying to target certain notes. Is that why?
Well, yeah. So certainly we're trying to target certain notes. Well, it's this, right? Like in music, you're always going to refer to something based off of a reference point, right? So I don't know. For example, like if you use, solfege, right? Do is always going to be your 1 if you're using movable do, right?
Right.
So in the same way, like when we're talking about G Dorian, and like why do we have it there as opposed to F major? Well, it's because we want to know that the 1 is G. So if we labeled G Dorian as F major, it would be like, oh, make sure you land on the 2. But it's not really the 2 because the root is G.
Right.
Yeah, it's like referencing that musical information in light of the context of the chord.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that'll help you, I like, avoid clashing notes that would be like a sus4, for example, over a chord that maybe you create a melodic line and you're using the scale, you're using voice leading, but you end up landing or resolving to a sus4 on a chord that really needs to be resolved. And that's why it's important, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and especially with jazz, it's like not every single note is created equal. We need to be intentionally choosing our notes to outline those harmonies. So to your point, if you land on a 3, every listener, whether they're musically educated and are like, I see that you landed on the 3, which hopefully no one's thinking that, but some people do, right? Or if somebody who's just listening to it and enjoys it, their ears are going to feel settled and it's going to rest in them well. It'll allow them to connect to the music rather than to the wrong note.
Gotcha. So I know I kind of backtracked a little bit because we talked about rhythm as a good starting point to like start making things musical. And I brought it back a little bit to the scale mapping, if you don't mind there. But so far kind of like what we have is, you start by, you just have to identify the scales of what you play over the jazz standard. And then secondly, you have to figure out how to connect those scales together. We do that through scale mapping. And I guess the third thing that we talked about, or the second thing we talked about, but is rhythm being something that we can use as a kind of jumping off point, forgetting about actual different notes to play. So after rhythm, what's the next logical step perhaps to making scales musical?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so I think the thing that breaks it out of scales is intervals, right? So we can play a scale and it can be linear and everything is a step, but much of jazz language is actually combining these leaps and these steps together to outline chords, and it's pretty brilliant. So I share in the course that the first lick I ever learned was
right,
and it's literally right. It's like skipping up and stepping down. And that's all it is. But when you play that, your ears are like, oh, jazz,
right.
And so once you've added some rhythm, I think the next step is how can I split up these notes? How can I add intervals and combine them with steps to make this sound a little bit more authentic?
Right. So what are some how would you decide what intervals to hit and steps to make? I guess that's a hard question to answer, but I think that's really the crux of the problem, right? It's like, well, we have all these notes, but then how do we know what intervals to actually hit? Like what's going to be the most effective, I guess?
Yeah. Well, so I think at first, and maybe forever, right? Like your 1, 3, 5, 7 are notes you want to hit. You want to hit those notes.
Those are the chord tones.
Because those are the chord tones. They're the most important, and they're also really safe, right? Like you could hang out on any one of those notes, and it's going to sound perfect.
Yeah.
So I think you start there. Now, I find that like a good amount of jazz language, it's almost as steady, or it sounds as solid to be on the 9, right? Like
hitting extensions is totally appropriate.
100% appropriate, but not always necessary, right? So I guess your question was, how do you pick the notes, right? Chord tones, that's how you pick them, right? And you want to be linking together your chord tones with the scale. So if you are hopping down, maybe you are walking up, right? Gotcha. If you're walking up, or if you're hopping up, maybe you're walking down.
Gotcha. That's actually a pretty pro tip right there, because like even just that simple line that you just kind of came out of, the top of your head right there, just by like going up through the chord tones there intervallically, and then just walking down, that sounded organic somehow. So that's interesting. So intervallic leaps up and then walking it down the scale, or some sort of variation of that, or vice versa.
Yeah, and the math works out on that really brilliantly, right? Because we're talking about like what are important notes to land on. So if you're hopping up, right? Let's say we're hopping up on the 1 chord and we're going, 3, 5, 7, 9. If you walk down from the 9 and you're in 4, 4, you land on a chord tone. You land on the 5.
Right.
So it's like, I've arrived home. So yeah, the numbers also work out on that well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think the other thing that I would say, and maybe a challenge for the listeners today, is to just simply experiment, but only use the actual tones in the scale, right? Try what happens when you go 1, 2, 3, and then jump up to the 5, or what happens when you go 1, 3, 5, 7, and then walk down from the 6, right? I mean, so what happens when you do that, and using that scale mapping idea of how do you connect those scales together, that already is going to start giving you some musical ideas and getting outside of that linear pattern that we call scales.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing with intervals that I think breaks it open as well is like, your upper and lower neighbor groups, which, the more I think about this is like you're professionally missing notes, right? Like,
yeah,
like in a really intentional way, where it's like, okay, we know that maybe we experiment. Our listeners are going to go home and experiment. They're going to say, what happens if I go 1, 2, 3, 5, right? And maybe that's step 1. And then the next question is like, how can I miss the 5 and then get back to it? How can I miss I want to land on the 5, but rather than landing on the 5, I'm going to go up to the 6, and I'm going to approach that 5 from below. Like, how can I? Yeah. So,
give an example of that.
So if here's like, I'm playing an F major chord in my left hand, and my right hand is just playing C, D, E, G, right? But if I'm thinking, how can I like miss that G in an intentional way? I might go. Or something like that, so that we want this G to stand out. So maybe we go up, and maybe we even walk up after. But
and we're using chromaticism there, or was that all diatonic?
No, that's just I'm starting on the 5, so I'm like going C, D, A, E, F, G.
Right. So essentially, and sometimes we call this in jazz circles enclosure, because you're essentially enclosing a target note with, like you said, upper and lower neighbors, as they call it. So, the upper being, I guess if you're visualing a music staff, like the note above it, and then you go the note below it, that's the lower neighbor, and then you're arriving at that target note.
And there are examples of this all over the place too, right? Like if you listen to any bebop head, you're gonna hear like somewhere where it's literally like above, below, And that right there is just, it's a little bit of chromaticism and an interval and a broken interval.
Right.
All coming, by the way, from the major scale.
Yeah. And when you're talking about all this, like I'm thinking, honestly, intervals and steps is really the secret sauce, and like you said, like that's a real tool that you can use. The upper and lower neighbors, aka enclosures, like that's a real tool that you can use. I also love that you're talking about, like, yeah, try 1, 3, 5, 7, but then what happens when you skip the 5 and come back to it? Like, so there's so many different things you can do, but you're just using the scales, right? You're just using that. Yeah, that's really powerful already. So I feel like, we've got identifying the scales, we've got mapping out the scales so we can connect them together. We've got just using rhythms, like just simple rhythms. And then we've got actually adding intervals and steps, which I feel like makes it a little bit melodic. What are some other ways we could start making scales more musical?
Yeah. So I guess we sort of touched on this a little bit in terms of like adding some chromatic passing tones.
Yeah.
I think that does help to bring out, to make it more musical. And also this is the other thing, right? Like you could play something musical on like a pop tune that's not going to sit well in
Right.
a jazz, right? And vice versa, by the way. So it's like, also making choices that reflect the language, or making choices that look and sound like the tradition of jazz. But more than all of that, I think it comes down to prioritizing your melody over your mathematics, right? So we know what types of notes to use. We know some like tactics where we can be like, we're gonna maybe do intervals up and we're gonna step down. But we could also just make a beautiful melody. We could also just play some notes in a row, and maybe for whatever reason we actually land on the 6th note and you're playing a major chord, where you get a sound that like this. It's not the most resolved, but if you're making a melody and the listener can grab onto it, well, maybe that's okay.
Right. I think a lot of it is just trial and error in some cases. I think a lot of times improvisers don't really give themselves they don't allow themselves to do that, to really like to just try things, right? To just slow things down and compose ideas.
Yeah. Well, I say this to my students all the time. And I teach all ages, but I teach a good amount of young kids. And I tell them, if you liked something, play it again.
Yeah.
And improvisation, I think, gets mistaken for like the spontaneous combustion of brilliant ideas.
Right.
But it's really not that. It's really more like you played something, you liked it, you learned it in every key, you did a couple variations, and now it's a part of your, dialogue or your tool bag of ideas that you have. And I think, really when we're talking about, such and such is a really great improviser, really like they've found some stuff that they've liked, and they've composed some ideas, maybe like you said, but then they composed so many ideas that they're all sort of connected. And then all of a sudden you get these minor variations, but when Chick Corea plays, it's him.
Right.
Because he has language.
Right. And you can only really develop that language by making it yourself. Because, I think that's a lot. And that's something that we really like. I mean, we do like all the time in Learn Jazz Standards. All of our stuff is we really try to incorporate the idea of, learn things from recordings, learn scales, learn all this stuff. But, if you learn something from a recording and, you learn a lick, or maybe it's a part of a solo, if you don't go out and actually try to create something out of that yourself, you're less likely to actually regurgitate any of that stuff. But the stuff that you create yourself is so much more likely to come out. So when we're thinking about scales, we're not thinking about, we start with all those basics that we've talked about, right? Like the mapping and all that stuff, because we're just trying to identify what the pitch collections are. Like, what notes do we actually have available to us? But then we have to compose something out of that that makes sense to us, right? And And it's not going to happen by just knowing that you can play Dorian over top of the 2 chord. Well, you have to do something with that Dorian to make it work.
100%. And when you find one thing that works, keep it, and then find another, and then find another. And if you feel stuck, take the time to compose something and internalize it. And I think you can really make things your own. This is a great exercise. Here's like a tangible takeaway. If there's something that you like to play, find 3 jazz standards that you know and ask where you can fit it.
Right.
And just try and get that line in there somewhere. And we talk a little bit about this in the course as well, this idea of like motivic development, where you take an idea, maybe you take a melody line, like, right, all diatonic, all comes from the chords, but I have this one idea and I just made it fit over more of the tune. And like, now that idea is mine, you know, now it's, and I say it's mine, like I've not patented that melody line, but like it's internalized because I've taken it and I've used it in multiple contexts. It's in my hand, it's in my ear, it's in my brain, it's there when I want it.
Well, that's also what people really kind of want to hear. They don't want to hear a bunch of and this is where like just playing scales for scales can lead to this, is just playing notes for playing notes. But they want to hear ideas. They want to hear a conversation happening when you're playing. So that is a good tool. And just to also make a connection here, a motif is really a rhythmic idea combined with a melody. And we talked at the beginning about what's like kind of like one of the most basic ways you can make scales musical, just add rhythms to it, right? So now if you're just adding rhythms and then using those scale tones to create a melodic idea, just like you did, right? You just basically applied scale tones over top of those chords and just transposed them essentially with the same rhythm. All of a sudden you've already, I mean, that didn't sound like scales at all, what you did.
Right. Yeah. And that's it. And you know what? This is the other thing that I think we need to just free listeners from a little bit. The fanciest is not the best.
Right. I agree with that.
The most complex is not the best. You can play really simple and sound great. You can play simple diatonic lines that are not super fast, that are not super out there and complex and the hippest thing that you've ever heard, and sound awesome, right?
Yes.
Just do the tune honor. Know some notes that you can play. Keep it really simple. Like approach it from like a joyful place where you're kind of like, yeah, this is where I am on my musical journey right now. There's no pressure to play above the level that you're at. Like, keep it simple and express yourself where you are. You know, serve the song and serve the music.
Yeah. Wow. That's really the magic right there, what you just said. And I think that will, I mean, hopefully people take that to heart and that will free people up a little bit, because that is something that I think a lot of people worry about. They're trying to play the hippest new thing, or, you know, they go into YouTube and hear the guy shredding the most crazy fast, you know, chromatic, Coltrane licks. And they're like, oh, I want to sound like that. But you can also sound really great just with the information you have now. I think that's the heart of kind of the conversation with scales anyways, is scales are really basic. There's not much to them, especially when we talk about scales, because like we talked about at the beginning of the episode, we think about scales and applying them over jazz standards as, let's pick the simplest ones, because after that you can apply the mapping. After that you can apply rhythms. After that you can apply intervals. After that you can apply upper and lower neighbors. After that you can maybe target the third. Like, right? Like all those things. And that's very simple, basic information. All you have to do is start organizing it, and you can make really great sounding stuff with just that little information. You don't have to, be able to shed crazy Coltrane licks over stuff.
No. And, you know, you look at players like Miles Davis, or,
yeah,
I mean, he's honestly the best example of this. Now, obviously the guy can shred, right? Like he can play a ton of really fast notes, but he just doesn't always.
No.
And when he doesn't, you're like, man, like he'll play some notes that are just so long or so open, and the rest of the band's maybe just going to town. They're blazing away, right? But like, he's not, and he sounds incredible. Right?
I think the best example of that is just the Kind of Blue album, which most people are kind of familiar with. Pretty much every solo on that album, Miles Davis plays very simple melodic musical ideas, you could almost pull every single one of those notes from the modes. I would even say that, you know, he is limited with how much chromaticism he even uses on that album. But then all of a sudden it switches to, you know, one of the other guys, Coltrane, and all of a sudden it's like, yeah, all the notes are coming out of everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So,
and you know what? If you could make the argument, especially with people like Coltrane who are playing a million notes, like those million notes are founded on a deep and relational and experiential connection to the things that are the most simple.
oh, 100. Oh, I think there's no debating that at 100%. I think it's just interesting to listen to the difference between the two of them, but realize that how powerful what Coltrane is playing, I mean, and what Miles is playing, it's equally powerful in my opinion. Now you may prefer one or the other. It doesn't really matter, but simple really works. You know, it really does work.
Yep.
So yeah, wholeheartedly agree with that. Well, just to close up the show today, for those who are interested, Brett has made a really, really awesome, when we call them in our Inner Circle membership, 101 courses. They're basically shorter courses that really deep dive into a subject. And he talks all about making skills musical, really deep dives into some of this stuff. So if you're an Inner Circle member, of course, you have access to that. If you're not an Inner Circle member, of course, you can sign up. But Brett, why don't you tell us just a tiny bit about what you've done with that course?
Yeah. So we've talked so much about it today. I think this is the heart of it, is like me and you we've talked about it today, but the course actually does it, right? So I'm going to explain all of the modes that you need, all of the scales that you need to work through Have You Met Miss Jones? We're going to do a scale map together, and we're going to look at the voice leading and why some of the modes don't always look the way that they should, because we sort of prioritize that voice leading. We're going to take 3 different rhythms, and we're going to work through using just the vanilla diatonic scales and create a real solo from that. We'll do another one that's similar, where we're creating motifs that have intervals. And then at the end of the course, we culminate with an etude that combines all of these simple ideas into jazz language. So, you know, this is the biggest takeaway, right? If you take this course, if you take this 101 course, you will walk away with a solid process that you can put over the top of any jazz standard. You can walk through these 6 steps and come out with something that reflects you, with a solid solo that sounds like legitimate jazz language.
Yeah, I love it. You did such a great job with that. Thanks for sharing a little bit about the course. Man, it was so great having you. Thanks for taking the time to just come on the show and share all of this stuff. I think we'd be remiss to leave this podcast episode without talking about, if you're a keyboard player and you know you're looking for your Ableton setup and all the things with Ableton and keyboard and live keyboard. Brett, you do have livekeyboardist.com is your project, which you're really rocking it there, YouTube channel as well. So definitely check you out there. But thank you so much, Brett. Appreciate you. We'll have you on again soon, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brent. Always a pleasure to be here.